Hello everyone, Professor Kurzluck here. So I wanted to make a video covering chapter 2, really looking at why do dictatorships emerge. So in chapter 1 of our textbook, we read and we talked about in class what authoritarian regimes are, what they look like, how they take different forms, how they're not all the same, how they are kind of on a spectrum. So chapter 2 takes this question, this foundational material that we've thought about and that we will continue to look at throughout the semester, and asks this seemingly basic but in reality pretty complex question of where do dictatorships, where do authoritarian regimes come from? Why does one country develop into a democracy where another turns into an authoritarian government? And we'll find throughout our textbook, throughout the semester, throughout our readings on democratization, that this is a really difficult question to hammer out. So maybe while you were doing the reading, you encountered a ton of different authors, and you were like, "Wow, this question doesn't really have a simple explanation, or authors don't necessarily even agree." So when scholars ask, why does a country become authoritarian? Then why does it become a military dictatorship? Why does it become a single party regime, a personalist regime, or maybe even a monarchy? So these foundational questions, we saw from the reading that different authors really highlight and argue different rationale for why this happens. So our big takeaway, even at the 30,000 foot level from the reading, is that there is no one single cause for dictatorship. Countries do not simply become authoritarian because they are poor, because of their culture, or because someone decides to simply seize power. Instead, authoritarianism usually develops from some combination of economic conditions, maybe weak political institutions, social conflict, something called path dependency, so we can just think about its history, and international politics. So when we think about the chapter, we can think about it as, why are some countries more likely to become democratic while others become more authoritarian or just authoritarian? And if authoritarianism does emerge in that country, why do different types of authoritarians, dictatorships develop? So we'll walk through the chapter from the way the author does. So let's start with the first question. Some of the earliest explanations of authoritarianism came from scholars trying to understand the rise of fascism, the rise of totalitarianism in Europe. Countries such as Germany, countries such as Italy experienced enormous political polarization, ideological conflict, economic stability, and social division. So we see that the way the authors lay it out is they lay out how different scholars have tried to understand this, building on earlier scholars. One early argument that we see emerging from this time, trying to make sense of why dictatorships are emerging, they argued that severe instability can make authoritarian movements more attractive. If people believe that the existing political system cannot maintain order, some folks may become more willing to support leaders who promise stability, unity, and control. We still hear about this today, maybe in Latin American and South American countries, where there is this reemergence of strongmen. And so some scholars are pointing to, some practitioners and just talking heads are saying, oh, this instability breeds a demand from citizens, from people in the country, that they want stability, so they look for strong men who are saying, okay, I can bring back stability to the country. We do know that political scientists have said maybe there are limitations to that debate, that discussion. We saw political scientists at this era saying, okay, we need explanations that go beyond particular experiences of fascist Europe. But that's not to say some scholars don't still look at the world that way. And if you're just listening to the news, you're reading the news, you've probably encountered that explanation of why we see an emergence of strongmen again today. So another argument that we see starting to emerge comes from a pretty well-known political scientist, Samuel Huntington, who focuses on political institutions. Huntington points out that societies can change very quickly. Economic development can bring urbanization, education, new social groups, and greater demands for political participation. But these political institutions, as we read, do not always develop the same. Imagine a country where more and more citizens want political influence, but the political parties are weak. Government institutions are ineffective. And of course, oftentimes corruption is widespread. The political system may have difficulty managing all of these new demands from citizens. So one of Huntington's important lessons, and why he's still taught so often in universities, is that modernization does not automatically produce democracy. Rapid social change combined with weak institutions can actually produce instability and create opportunities for authoritarian rule. So that brings us to one of these big debates that I mentioned at the outset within political science and within our chapter. The relationship between economic development and democracy. Another well-known political scientist, Seymour Lipset, gives us the classic modernization argument, which is still prevalent today. As countries become wealthier, people tend to become more educated, cities grow, we see this growth of urbanization, which leads to a growth of a middle class, and citizens demand greater political participation as they enter the middle class, as they form civil society in urban areas. They demand greater political participation. The simplified version, the simplified version that our textbook gives us is that economic development should make democracy more likely. So this is a view that some scholars today continue to utilize. Well, of course, we can imagine other scholars up until today push back from. I gave a presentation once at a conference, and the first question I received is, well, why didn't you use modernization theory? So it's still a big, important theory today, but we know historically and up until today, other scholars are pushing back against this theory. Adam Przeworski complicates this argument, kind of pushes back a bit. Przeworski and his colleagues agree that wealthy countries are more likely to be democratic, but they question whether becoming wealthy actually causes dictatorships to democratize. Does it lead to democratization? Instead, they argue that wealth may be especially important because it makes democracy more stable once it already exists. So the relationship between wealth and democracy is strong. The disagreement, they argue, is about exactly why that relationship exists. Natural resources make this even more complicated. Some authoritarian countries are extremely wealthy. Historically, they have been, and today they have been, because they possess fossil fuels, they possess hydrocarbons, or other valuable resources. Our reading highlights Michael Ross's argument that oil wealth can help authoritarian regimes, authoritarian governments survive because rulers do not have to develop as they don't have to rely, I guess, as heavily on taxation from citizens. Oil revenues can instead be used to provide benefits, reward support, strengthen the state, and importantly, fund security services, fund maybe the crackdown on society. So rulers then don't really need to rely on citizens. That oil wealth allows them to crack down on citizens. Now, it's important that we note that does not mean that oil automatically causes dictatorship. It means that resource wealth can give authoritarian rulers tools to make staying in power easier. So when we think about, this path to democratization, oil wealth makes it so rulers have more incentive to stay in power, more power to stay in power, and can use that wealth to crack down on society. We also see in the chapter discussion about social class and inequality, which can also matter as well. The author highlights Barrington Moore, who famously argued that no bourgeoisie, no democracy. His point was that an economically independent middle class can become an important force demanding political rights. But we can imagine a society with a very small, wealthy elite and a very large population. Wealthy elites may worry that democracy would allow the poor majority, the rest of society, to vote for redistribution of that wealth. So under those conditions, some elites may actually prefer an authoritarian system that protects the existing economic order that they benefit from. So again, none of these factors automatically produces dictatorship. They change the incentives facing political actors. There is also talk, and we see it in our reading, about explanations based on ethnicity, maybe based on different cultures. So ethnically diverse countries, as our reading highlights, are not automatically less democratic. Diverse societies can develop political institutions that allow groups to share power and manage disagreement peacefully. Political culture may matter. Democratic institutions are probably easier to sustain when citizens support participation, tolerance, and democratic role. But saying that a country is authoritarian simply because it has an authoritarian culture does not really explain very much, as our authors highlight. Cultures and political attitudes can and do change over time. So we see that similar to chapter 1, there's a lot of disagreement between authors about, why do authoritarian regimes exist? Why do they stick around? So we should remember how in chapter 1 we talked about that not all dictatorships, not all authoritarian regimes are the same. So when we think about, why do they emerge? We see this massive debate. Why do they stick around? Why is democratization hindered? We see this debate. So the second part of the chapter that we should think about is, why do particular types of dictatorships emerge? So the first we can look at is military dictatorships. Most military dictatorships, of course, understandably, begin with a military coup. But not every military coup results in the military governing permanently. The military is more likely to intervene. They're more likely to have a military coup when civilian governments appear weak, or maybe if there's a lot of political instability on the rise, it looks like the country might be falling apart. Maybe the economy is falling apart and deteriorating, or military leaders believe that their interests are being threatened. So we can imagine why military military coups occur if they hit these, they check these boxes. Military rule also becomes more likely when the military is one of the best organized, one of the strongest institutions within a country. So again, it doesn't mean that every military coup remains a military dictatorship, but we do see that sometimes military coups, the military sticks around. As we talked about in class, it's nice to be king, it's nice to have the power and the resources. So the textbook uses the example of Latin America, provides many examples of this. Militaries become powerful institutions in Latin America. Civilian political institutions become weak. Inequality and political conflict occurs as well. We saw these during the Cold War as well, the emergence of military coups. We don't see as many today as we did maybe 50 years ago. So personalistic regimes, monarchies they emerge differently depending on how strong the institutions are, depending on how diverse power is in the state. I know this video is getting pretty long. I'm sorry, I'm going on and on and on. So the big takeaway that we need to think about is there is no single cause of dictatorship. And it is equally difficult to understand, okay, why does the military coup remain a military dictatorship versus why does a personalistic regime emerge and stay in power? So this will be something that we talk about and emerges over the next 15 weeks that we're together. But it's important here at the outset just to understand from our chapter that different authors look at this differently. Thank you.